The Best of Our Knowledge explores topics on learning, education, and research. Coming up, published in 1995, James W. Loewen's Lies My Teacher Told Me continues to challenge the U.S. education system and everything we thought we knew about American history. The book has now been adapted into a graphic novel. We'll speak with illustrator and National Book Award-winning cartoonist Nate Powell. I'm Lucas Willard, host of The Best of Our Knowledge. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. First published in 1995, James W. Loewen's Lies My Teacher Told Me continues to challenge the U.S. education system and everything we thought we knew about American history. The book saw new editions published in 2007 and 2018, and a Young Readers edition was published in 2019. The textbook is now available in a new form as a graphic novel. Published by the New Press, Lies My Teacher Told Me was adapted and illustrated by Nate Powell, a Bloomington, Indiana-based comics artist. Powell began self-publishing comics in the early 1990s. His work has been recognized by numerous awards, and he is the first comic book artist to ever win a National Book Award for his work on the March series of graphic novels co-authored with Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis and Andrew Aydin. Now, with Lies My Teacher Told Me, Powell's illustrations bring to life a book that dispels the myths of American history. I spoke with Nate Powell about his new book and his prior knowledge of the source material.
I first read Lies My Teacher Told Me in my mid-20s. It was around 2005. I had heard the name of the book for several years prior to that. So I think I kind of did the hop, skip, and a jump from A People's History of the United States, which I read around 2000. And then after I hungered for more, and a lot of the information that I had become aware of, especially through punk and alternative zines and publications, record inserts, a lot of these kind of pointed back towards James Loewen's work. And so it was this kind of nice homecoming when I finally devoured the book around 2005. I guess I read it maybe 4 times or so over the years before James Loewen got in touch with me to ask about adapting it. Along, in the course of those years, that's when I did the March trilogy, did a few other nonfiction long form comics, and had kind of built up enough chops to gain an awareness of how to boil down such a dense, wild, varied text into something that worked and remained kind of concrete and clear.
How did James Loewen reach out to you? Were you surprised to get that email in your inbox one day in 2020?
It was a complete surprise, yes. So this was about a month before the world shut down. And it was fantastic timing. I had just finished a couple of books. I was starting my own solo work, but my schedule was fairly open. Little did any of us know just how open our schedules would be. But he wrote me out of the blue and very politely, but directly, he was like, "I'm not sure how familiar you are with my work, but I was wondering if you're interested in doing a comics adaptation of Lies My Teacher Told Me." It gave the briefest rundown. But I wrote him back within minutes. I didn't even speak to my agent or anything. And I was like, yes, 100 times yes. We'll work out the details along the way. But I already see in my head how the book will look as we push along. So let's get started now.
Did James Loewen read March, or had he heard about your work with John Lewis?
So James Loewen had met Congressman Lewis, several times, but met Congressman Lewis and Andrew Aydin at the National Book Festival in the mid-2010s for March. That was one of the speaking engagements that I couldn't go to. I was probably, frankly, drawing the next volume of March, so we did a little division of labor there. But he met the rest of my crew and spoke. And he specifically reached out, yes, because of my work on March. And I think that sort of helped bridge the gaps and helped see the potential of comics as a medium and as a format to articulate and revitalize the ideas in his work.
What do you see in comics and what makes them effective? And what were your influences growing up in reading comics that really stuck with you?
Well, I'd say the greatest strengths and the unique strengths of comics for doing work like historical and educational work simply has to do with being able to seamlessly merge and bounce back and forth between objective and subjective viewpoints, being able to instill, almost inherently instill empathy in the reader, so that you're able to present fairly complex ideas. And in the case of nonfiction comics, lay out pretty complicated histories. But if you're able to root them in humanity, in character, in a sense of narrative, people who are comics literate, which is most Americans, like under the age of 70, are fairly comics literate. It's a very natural narrative process by which people are able to put themselves in other people's shoes, in other people's experiences, and a lot is going on in your brain at once when you're reading a comic. There's a lot of non-textual information that's visual, but it's still chock full of information. So I always try to tell people every detail that you're absorbing and all the context between all the visuals, all the text, it's all information and it's all working at once. Growing up, I was born in the late 70s, so I grew up on like mostly 80s and 90s superhero comics. But early on, some big influences were sort of an outlier Marvel comic about the Vietnam War from the perspective of drafted teenagers on a tour of duty. It was called The Nam, and I grew up in a military family, and that really opened a lot of doors for me to be able to have deeper, more complex conversations with my dad about his service, about military, military dynamics, about conformity, all kinds of stuff. One of the biggest influences on this book would be the Cartoon History of the Universe, which came out in a 3-volume set, I think during the 1980s and 90s, but I didn't read it until about 5 years ago. And really helped it helped me understand how to instill this type of narrative with a sense of humor and sass. Because when you read the original version of Lies My Teacher Told Me, the thing that immediately struck me was how much personality you're getting from James Loewen. And I love the sort of irreverent, but fair approach he takes to everything. He's not afraid to have a viewpoint, but he's very willing to establish that he is presenting his viewpoint and then back away from it. So it really helped to kind of see sass in action on the comics page.
And actually, not to get too far into the book right away, but you actually draw James Loewen giving a lecture to students in the book, and he answers questions, and you see the students' facial expressions, and there's a lot of personality that you build into James Loewen. At the same time, when we're reading his words, you're actually depicting him on the page as well.
Indeed. One of my very first narrative considerations when I was adapting this into comics form, especially thinking back about my work on March, and the fact that, I lucked out as a cartoonist because, in March, John Lewis is giving his subjective first person account of an objective mass movement historical event. And recognizing that, in fact, I needed a character and I needed a setting in which to let all this American history unfold. So that is when I was like, wait a minute, James Loewen sets up so much personality on the page just in his original text. This is going to work best if I if I frame the entire book inside the confines of a classroom. So usually when he's present leading the narrative himself, we're in a college kind of mini auditorium. Whenever we sort of step away from his perspective and get into more sort of reflection on the history, usually I drop us into a high school classroom because most of the content is equally distributed between textbooks and at the high school and college level.
The book begins with Christopher Columbus in 1492, the myths of Christopher Columbus, and the heroism, the hero worship that is present in American politics. And then it goes all the way through the present. There is discussion on 9/11 and the war in Iraq. But after that, there's also drawings in your depictions of the inauguration of former President Trump, the Black Lives Matter movement. So this has been a book that's been updated over the years in multiple editions by James Loewen. But when you spoke with him, why was it important to continue that updating process and bring it into as close to now 2024 as possible?
Well, updating the book as we move forward in real time really gets back to the core of why James Loewen made the book in the first place, was recognizing that one of the fundamental problems with teaching American history is that, as most of us know from our own high school experiences, you never actually get to recent history. And so, I never got past 1918 in any of my 3 American history classes in high school. And so he consistently felt it was important, both in the 95 edition and the 2017 edition, to reflect upon how quickly history happens and how much our understanding and interpretation of history changes as more information becomes available. When we say history is a living thing, a lot of that actually depends on gaining new information and new perspective as the years go by. And so I guess in relation to that, comics take a long time to make. So, I spent about 3.5 years doing this book, and I had already been in the situation with March and with Save It for Later after that, where I recognized that the book was going to be published in an unknowable social and political future. And a lot of my own editorial process and considerations had to do with how to make the content of the book as bulletproof as possible, how not to bite off too big of a bite for myself to chew, but how to essentially write for the future. So when I got started in 2020, 2021, I knew this was coming out in 2024 and was constantly kind of looking forward while trying to summon up the boldness to write and draw about events that were unfolding in real time.
Why do you see this as a companion to the original book? And then looking towards the future of the book, how do you think that it being in a comics form will give the original book more life, a new life?
One of my first considerations when I started breaking down the original text to comics form was recognizing how I was going to pull off this book without it being a 500-page comic. No, let's be frank, nobody wants to read that. I don't want to read that. So I set limitations in place, structural, formal limitations, and I try to keep it under 300 pages, which I did. But along the way, recognizing that, number one, there were anecdotes and there were examples from history which would have to remain on the cutting room floor for the comics adaptation, though it didn't change the narrative arc, any of his main points, or any of the major hits that were happening. But number two, the real joy of reading James Loewen's original volumes are his thorough footnotes in the back of the book, and everything that's anytime there's an annotation, you really get to the meat and the potatoes and some of the most fascinating stuff in the back of the book. And so recognizing that a lot of this stuff is going to be, it's a process of cultivating curiosity and encouraging it. So I felt like I had a responsibility as an author and as a cartoonist to be like, hey, if this stuff is blowing your mind, or if you want to learn more, there's always tons more information in his original volumes, including important stuff like sourcing for all the information in my own edition. So knowing that the original versions of the book are widely available, I felt it was important to actively encourage people to reference those for more examples from history, for sourcing, for some of the more hilarious and outrageous footnotes to the book, in addition, like I feel that there's definitely, like sort of a perennial status to the original version of Lies My Teacher Told Me. However, every few years it is important to reintroduce the information. And I feel like even converting it to another medium helps a reader have an entirely fresh perspective on what they may already be used to reading in prose form. And it works like that for me too. I had read it so many times that I was pretty familiar with the contents. And yet, once I started breaking it down in this visual narrative form, a lot of his examples and a lot of his points became completely fresh and new to me as I approached them from a new angle and considered new details to the situation and how it applied to young people.
You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. If you're just joining us, Nate Powell is a National Book Award-winning comics artist and illustrator whose most recent project is a graphic novel adaptation of James Loewen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbooks Got Wrong, published by the New Press. James Loewen's original book that challenges the U.S. education system was published in 1995 and has sold millions of copies. Even before Loewen wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me, he was intimately familiar with attempts by government to ban books. In 1980, Loewen and editor Charles Salas successfully challenged in court an attempt by the Mississippi State Textbook Purchasing Board to ban a ninth grade history textbook they co-wrote called Mississippi Conflict and Change. At a time when school curricula are once again at the center of the culture war, I asked Powell if the latest version of Lies My Teacher Told Me has garnered any pushback.
Not yet. I do know over the past year and a half, just looking through, like, a lot of my peers, friends, contemporaries have had legal challenges and bans to their own graphic novels. March has had its share of challenges as well. But what I find is becoming more common is a kind of soft censorship, which is, in my opinion, the natural desired goal by the book ban and information averse community, the reality averse community, is to present enough pressure, enough of the risk of prosecution or threats to the safety of educators or librarians that teachers, librarians, educators will simply pass on one book and opt for another in order to reduce that level of risk that they are unfairly having to shoulder. This is a lot harder to trace because it's kind of like locating a black hole in space. You're looking for where the pressure isn't. You're looking for where the points of light and the action are not. But this is where it's just important to kind of stay in touch with people who are teachers, people who are library workers, people who do stand up for comics in particular, because comics also are disproportionately targeted by the book ban campaigns.
James Loewen died while you were working with him in creating the graphic novel adaptation of Lies My Teacher Told Me. When he died, how was it for you as an illustrator to pick it up and keep going with it?
Well, when James Loewen contacted me in January 2020, a few days later, we got on the phone for the very first time to really talk about the nuts and bolts of adapting the book for the first time. And in that very first conversation, he was very upfront that that he had cancer, that he was doing great, everything was perfectly fine at the time, but he was very upfront with his mortality, and was making sure that I knew where he stood, and knew that, when his time came, that it was unknowable to him. He was like, it may take me in 6 years, it may take me in 6 months. That's doubly why it's important for you to take to pass the torch to you. That's also why this is a full adaptation by me. He updated his work in 2017, and especially over those first 6 months of working on the book, we talked on the phone and over email a lot, and that's when I brought up a lot of my post 2017 notes and questions to kind of get his perspective at the time. And I felt very assured, both from his own expectations of the work and his own the piece he had made with his mortality. We were supposed to finally meet for the first time, through the pandemic in November 2021. So in August of 2021 was when he passed away. And as far as I remember, I had finished penciling the entire book. Maybe I had 20 or 30 pages left to go, but I was almost done penciling the whole book. I had adapted all of it into hand lettered text that worked on my level. So I was right in the thick of it. And I was sitting right here at this desk in my studio. And in a lot of ways, it didn't change a whole lot about my mission and what I was doing. It simply required the time, the space, the humanity to kind of really reflect upon his life, upon his work, what it meant for him to trust me, and how to deliver on his work, and how to kind of like live up to something that I would like for him to have seen.
So the torch was effectively passed to you during this project, but do you feel that you now, as an artist and as a creator, have even more of a responsibility to continue, not necessarily the work on this project in particular, but in your next project, to continue the mission or the lessons that James Loewen was trying to convey, challenging authority, challenging popular ideas, giving a more whole and holistic truth to something that we think we might know about? Are these ideas going to carry through in your next project?
Without a doubt. I'd say what drew me to Lies My Teacher Told Me in the first place, what made it seem like such a natural fit, was the fact that these are shared themes throughout a lot of my work. A parallel work that I did, a fictional graphic novel at the same time called Fall Through, uh, oddly shared a lot of the major themes about being in the middle of something while it's happening and not having enough perspective to process a sequence of events which don't seem to add up, but also the power of a group of people mythologizing a very recent history as a means to discuss it and be able to relate to it. But along the way, in that course of mythologizing, losing so much of the details, losing a lot of the outlying stuff that doesn't fit in, and fundamentally losing the thread of what makes history weird and unique in the first place. So this is always stuff I've been drawn to outsiders, people fighting for dignity, fighting to be heard and taken seriously. And really what James Loewen's work highlights is that the very first things that get omitted from American history are these outliers, are the efforts of people who are working hard to be taken seriously, to be respected, and that there is purpose behind that, although some of the decisions to omit that history are very mundane and practical.
And any hints maybe on your next project about a subject or a theme, anything that you're working on, or any ideas that are kicking around on where you want to take those lessons in that story?
I do think there is a shorter nonfiction comics work that I'm cooking up with Andrew, the co-writer of March, that may have to do with an influential 19th century railroad strike in America and learning lessons from that. That's all I can say about it at the time. It's a little bit off, but we've been working back and forth every once in a while with doing stuff for the New York City Department of Education, making nonfiction comics. That's sort of one of Andrew's huge pet projects and a major focus in his life. So it's really nice to kind of team up on that again. And my next book is actually just more of a character study based work of fiction that really gets into the weeds of feelings. And so when I do long form nonfiction comics, it's very important for me to kind of swing the pendulum back and go into my fictional cave and just kind of get into make-believe characters, feelings, and relationships. And that kind of helps recharge my batteries so that I can spend a few years working on history again.
Well, Nate, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I really enjoyed it. And congratulations on the book, Why, As My Teacher Told Me, the graphic novel adaptation. Again, thanks for taking the time.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Nate Powell is the first cartoonist to win a National Book Award. The illustrator's latest project is a graphic novel adaptation of James W. Loewen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbooks Got Wrong, published by the New Press. At the end of a book challenging widely taught falsehoods in American schools, Loewen gives advice for how readers can approach the next, if unspecified, lie. Loewen says we can all become independent learners. He writes, quote, "Everyone should know how to sift through arguments and evidence and how to think through our decisions based on facts. That's how we learn how to learn, and no one-sided book or argument will be able to confuse us, even if the answers we find are inconvenient, disappointing, or uncomfortable," end quote. Loewen adds, quote, "History is central to our understanding of ourselves and our society. All Americans should be able to command the power of history," end quote. You're listening to The Best of Our Knowledge. I'm Lucas Willard. If you'd like to tell The Best of Our Knowledge what you think, send us an email at knowledge@wamc.org. You can listen to The Best of Our Knowledge anytime as a podcast, downloadable wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to catch up on past episodes or hear more WAMC National Productions programs on the news, academic study, books, women's issues, the media, and the environment, visit WAMCpodcasts.org. This has been The Best of Our Knowledge, episode 1758. The Best of Our Knowledge is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Thanks to associate producer Jody Cowan. The latest on all National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter and our flagship station's website, WAMC.org. Until next time, I'm Lucas Willard.